The November rain drummed against the window of Eliza Markham's boarding room on Lombard Street, each drop echoing the steady depletion of her meager savings. At 24, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that Baltimore society had once admired: auburn hair that caught lamplight like burnished copper, intelligent blue eyes, and the bearing of a woman raised with expectations of comfort. Now those expectations lay buried alongside her parents in Greenmount Cemetery. The letter in her hands bore the postmark of Red Mesa, Arizona territory, written on expensive cream paper that spoke of prosperity. Respectable cattleman seeks educated wife for partnership in building civilization on the frontier. It read. Comfortable home. Meaningful work opportunity for a woman of character to make her mark on the world. Jared McKee's subsequent correspondence had arrived weekly, each letter more persuasive than the last. He wrote eloquently of vast rangeland under endless skies, of a substantial adobe home, and of his desire for an intellectual companion rather than a mere housekeeper. His prose revealed education and refinement, speaking of evening conversations about literature and shared ambitions for bringing culture to the wilderness. What those carefully crafted letters never mentioned was Red Mesa's isolation from any meaningful law enforcement, or that McKee's word carried the weight of absolute authority in a town that existed solely at his sufferance. The 3-week journey west proved grueling beyond anything Eliza had imagined. She shared the cramped stagecoach with 5 other passengers, including a grizzled prospector heading to the silver mines, 2 businessmen seeking opportunities in territorial expansion, and a quiet man named Thomas Brennan, who claimed to be a surveyor mapping railroad routes for Eastern investors. Brennan proved unexpectedly attentive during the long hours of travel, engaging her in conversation about her destination and asking detailed questions about her background that seemed to exceed polite curiosity. He carried himself with subtle confidence, his clothes well made despite their practical appearance, and wore a silver pocket watch engraved with an intricate serpent design that he consulted frequently. First time West, Miss Markham, he inquired as they crossed into Colorado territory. Yes, and I confessed to some nervousness about such a dramatic change. She replied, grateful for his gentle manner after days of the prospector's crude stories and the businessmen's tedious arguments about tariffs. Understandable entirely. The frontier demands significant adjustment from refined ladies. Your intended must be quite prosperous to attract a woman of your obvious quality to such remote territory. Something in his tone made her glance at him sharply, but his expression remained pleasantly neutral. Still, she found herself reluctant to share details about McKee's letters or her financial circumstances that had necessitated this desperate gamble. Red Mesa announced itself with the metallic taste of alkali dust and the oppressive weight of desert heat that struck her like a physical blow upon stepping from the coach. The town squatted in a valley between red sandstone cliffs, its dozen weathered buildings clustered around a single dusty street that seemed to lead nowhere and originate from nothing. McKee awaited her at the station, a tall man in his early 40s, with steel-gray hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they encountered. His smile appeared warm as he helped her down from the coach, but his hands lingered on her waist with proprietary familiarity that made her skin crawl despite his polished manners. Miss Markham, he said, his voice carrying educated Eastern tones. Welcome to your new home. I trust the journey wasn't excessively arduous. Long but manageable, Mr. McKee. The country is certainly dramatic. As McKee collected her bags, she noticed Thomas Brennan watching them with unusual interest before disappearing toward the saloon without farewell. The oversight struck her as odd after his attentiveness during their journey, but McKee's presence demanded her attention. The ranch house initially impressed her with its sprawling adobe construction and apparent prosperity. Built in Spanish colonial style with thick walls and red tile roofing, it commanded several acres of fenced land dotted with outbuildings and corrals. But details began troubling her as McKee conducted his tour. The windows of what would be her bedroom bore iron bars, which he explained as protection from Apache raids. The household staff, 3 Mexican women, kept their eyes downcast and spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. Most disturbing were the other bedrooms, clearly intended for women, but currently empty their contents, suggesting hasty departures. Previous guests. "Undercover," she asked, fingering a hairbrush left on a dresser beside a bottle of lavender water and a daguerreotype of an elderly couple, on arrangements that proved unsuitable. McKee replied smoothly. "Some women find frontier challenges overwhelming, but I have confidence in your superior character." That first evening, they dined by candlelight, while McKee spoke eloquently of expanding his cattle operation and bringing civilization to the territory. He displayed genuine intelligence, discussing literature and current events with sophisticated understanding. Yet beneath his refinement, she sensed something predatory, a patient hunger that made her increasingly uneasy, despite his perfect courtesy. The transformation began on her second day. McKee's requests became commands, his suggestions turned into demands. When she expressed interest in visiting town or meeting other wives, his responses grew curtly dismissive. The household staff, she realized, were less employees than prisoners, their eyes holding the dull resignation of people who had learned that resistance brought suffering. "You're here to be my wife," he informed her when she questioned restrictions on her movements. "That means your place is in this house, tending to my needs and future children." Frontier life is unforgiving to women who fail to understand their proper role. By the third evening, any pretense of courtship had evaporated completely. McKee cornered her after dinner, his hands gripping her shoulders with bruising force as he outlined his expectations with chilling precision. "Tomorrow, Brother Samuel will perform our wedding ceremony," he stated, his voice carrying winter's chill. "You'll discover I maintain specific requirements for wives, and I tolerate neither disappointment nor disobedience." When she attempted to pull away, protesting her need for more time to know him properly, his response came swift and brutal. The back of his hand, across her cheek, sent her reeling into a bookshelf, her vision exploding with stars as leather-bound volumes tumbled around her. "You accepted my proposal and my money for transportation," he said, straightening his cuffs with deliberate care. "Now you'll honor that bargain, or discover that the desert shows no mercy to ungrateful women." That night, locked in her barred room with a swollen cheek and racing pulse, Eliza finally comprehended her true situation. The muffled sobbing from other parts of the house, the terrified expressions of the staff, the knowing smirks of McKee's men, everything painted a picture that froze her blood. She had sought a husband and found herself a prisoner instead. The escape came during a violent thunderstorm 2 nights later. She had spent hours working at the window bar with a metal hairpin, her fingers bloody from the effort, until she finally loosened one end sufficiently to squeeze through. The storm provided perfect cover as lightning illuminated her flight across the ranch yard while thunder masked the sound of her desperate footsteps. She estimated perhaps 6 hours before McKee discovered her empty room. But she knew his men were expert trackers, while her city-bred skills offered no match for the pitiless landscape. Still, the alternative submission to whatever fate McKee planned drove her forward through mud and driving rain, her traveling dress growing heavier with each step. Dawn arrived with crystalline air that already shimmered with building heat. Her leather boots, designed for Baltimore's cobblestones, were disintegrating on the rocky terrain. Her corset made breathing difficult in the thin atmosphere, and she had already consumed half the water stolen from the ranch kitchen. Near midday, exhaustion finally overwhelmed her. She had been following what appeared to be game trails through a labyrinth of red sandstone formations, hoping to find water or shelter, when heat and dehydration conspired against her. The world began spinning, her vision blurred, and she collapsed beside a dry creek bed lined with skeletal cottonwood trees. The Apache warrior discovered her there, drawn by vultures circling something still alive. Taza had been scouting alone, checking his people's traditional hunting grounds for signs of encroachment by white settlers or cavalry patrols. At 28, he ranked among the finest warriors in his band, skilled in the survival arts that kept his people alive in an increasingly hostile world. His first instinct upon seeing the collapsed figure was extreme caution. White settlers meant trouble, and solitary women usually indicated larger parties nearby. But as he crept closer, studying the scene with trained observation, details emerged that contradicted expected patterns. Her clothes were torn and muddy, suggesting flight rather than planned travel. No horse tracks marked the area, no signs of abandoned wagons or camping parties. Most significantly, when he rolled her onto her back to check for life signs, he saw something in her face that stopped him cold. Even unconscious, even marked by sun and exhaustion, something fierce inhabited her features. A stubborn set to her jaw, a determined angle to her brows that reminded him instantly and painfully of his sister Ayanna. His sister who had vanished 3 years ago during a raid taken by men who left no tracks and demanded no ransom. The resemblance was so powerful, it constricted his chest with familiar grief. Without fully understanding his motives, Taza found himself reaching for his water gourd instead of his knife. When Eliza's eyes fluttered open, the first thing she saw was a face painted with traditional war markings, red and yellow ochre, across bronze cheekbones, black around dark eyes, that studied her with careful intelligence. Terror should have overwhelmed her, but her throat was too parched for screams. "Water," she managed to whisper. Taza studied her for a long moment, weighing risks against possibilities. Then slowly, he lifted the gourd to her cracked lips. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it flowed like life itself into her desperate body. As strength gradually returned to her limbs, Eliza became acutely aware of her precarious situation alone in wilderness, with a man whose people were officially at war with hers, dependent entirely on his mercy for survival. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his dark eyes directly despite her fear. Something in that gaze, its direct honesty, the way she held his stare without flinching, despite obvious vulnerability, confirmed his initial impression. This woman possessed the kind of spirit he had learned to respect, regardless of the skin containing it. "Why you run?" he asked in carefully enunciated English. "Bad man. Want to hurt me?" Taza nodded grimly. He had witnessed enough of white settlements to understand that cruelty wore many faces and respected no boundaries of race or culture. "Desert kill you alone. Very quick. Then help me, please." For a moment, stretching like eternity, Taza weighed her request against represented dangers. Helping a white woman could bring soldiers to his people's stronghold, could ignite warfare consuming everyone he cherished. But the image of his sister's face memory of her fierce courage facing impossible odds tipped the balance. "I help," he said finally. "But you do what I say. Desert kill quick if you don't listen." As he helped her to her feet and gestured toward a narrow canyon cutting between towering rocks, she felt hope stirring, not based on promises or letters, but on proven kindness from a stranger who owed her nothing. The pursuit began before the sun reached its zenith. Baying hounds carried across the wasteland like Doom's voice, growing steadily louder as McKee's men followed her trail with methodical precision. Taza heard the dogs first, his head snapping up like a wolf sensing danger. "Down!" he hissed, grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward barrel cacti. Thorns scraped through her already torn dress as she pressed flat against rocky ground, biting back any sound of pain. Through gaps in the spiny fortress, she could see torches flickering, at least 8 riders, possibly more. McKee's voice carried clearly across the wasteland, harsh with frustrated rage. "She can't have gotten far on foot. Check every gulch, every cave, every shadow. I want her found before sunset. There's a bonus for whoever brings her back." One tracking hound, a lean bloodhound with intelligent eyes, paused near their hiding place and lifted its scarred muzzle to test shifting air currents. For heart-stopping moments, the animal seemed poised to discover them. But Taza had chosen their concealment with lifetime wisdom of evading enemies. Wind carried their scent away from sensitive nostrils, and pungent creosote bushes masked remaining traces. After tense seconds, feeling like hours, the hound padded away, following its handler toward a side canyon. They remained motionless for another hour, listening as the search party worked through the area with systematic thoroughness. Eliza's left leg began cramping from the awkward position, and a large red ant explored her outstretched hand with curious mandibles. But she endured in silence, understanding that one sound meant death for both. Finally, voices faded as searchers moved north toward mesas, offering countless hiding places. Taza waited another 30 minutes, his trained ear processing every sound, drifting across the landscape before signaling safety. When Eliza tried standing, cramped muscles betrayed her, sending sharp pain through her leg. She started crying out, but caught herself biting knuckles until she tasted blood. "Easy," Taza whispered, massaging her cramped calf with practiced efficiency until the worst pain subsided. They began moving again. But now their journey carried urgent character. Taza led her through bewildering mazes of arroyos and rock formations, following paths invisible to her untrained eyes. Every shadow could conceal enemies, every distant sound might herald discovery. As they traveled deeper into the desert labyrinth, Eliza found herself studying her unexpected protector. Despite his fearsome appearance, war paint, and weapons marking him as a warrior, he moved through the landscape with gentle reverence, reading signs in rocks and sky completely invisible to her. Near midnight, disaster struck. They were crossing treacherous terrain littered with cholla cacti, their segmented arms waiting to detach at the slightest touch, when Eliza's exhausted legs finally betrayed her. She stumbled, throwing out her hand instinctively, and came down hard on needle-sharp spines. Pain lanced through her palm like liquid fire. She bit her lip so hard she tasted copper to prevent screaming. The cholla segment clung to her hand like a malevolent creature, barbed spines embedded deep in her flesh. Taza was beside her instantly, working with methodical precision. Using 2 flat stones to grip the cactus segment, he pulled it free, then spent long minutes picking individual spines from her palm with his razor-sharp knife tip. Each extraction sent fresh agony through her hand. But she endured silently, understanding her life depended on absolute quiet. When finished, her palm looked like raw meat, punctured by dozens of tiny wounds, seeping blood in moonlight. Taza tore cloth from his own shirt and bound the injury tightly, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Brave woman," he said quietly, genuine respect in his voice. As they continued their flight through darkness, Eliza realized something fundamental had changed between them. She was no longer simply a burden he carried from memory and kindness. She had proven capable of enduring pain without compromising their safety, and in survival's unforgiving arithmetic that mattered more than words or gratitude. Behind them, distant torch glow suggested McKee's men continued searching with relentless predator patience. But for now, suspended between starlight and stone, she lived and remained free. Dawn brought intensified danger rather than relief. Cresting a low ridge, Eliza could see multiple dust clouds spreading across the desert like a closing fist's fingers. McKee had summoned reinforcements, probably offering substantial bounties for her capture. Taza's expression grew increasingly grave as he studied terrain ahead through narrowed eyes. He pointed toward distant ruins, an old stagecoach way station abandoned when Apache raids made the route too dangerous. "Water, maybe," he said. "Shade, but—" He gestured at the exposed position visible for miles in any direction. They had little choice. The sun was becoming merciless, and Eliza's wounded hand throbbed with infection's first signs. Without shelter and rest, she would be dead by noon. The station proved little more than weathered adobe walls and collapsed roof timbers, but provided blessed shade and, miraculously, an old well still holding brackish but drinkable water. Taza lowered his water gourd on braided leather rope and hauled up enough to refill their containers and clean Eliza's wound properly. While he worked, she explored the ruins and discovered a cache of supplies left by previous travelers, hardtack biscuits that could crack teeth, dried beans resembling pebbles, and a rusty but functional coffee pot. The food was stale and nearly flavorless, but represented her first real meal since escaping. "Tell me about your sister," she said as they shared the meager feast, speaking slowly with simple words she hoped he would understand. Taza remained quiet for a long moment, dark eyes studying her face as if measuring her worthiness to hear the story. Finally, he began speaking his English, halting but increasingly clear as emotion overrode uncertainty. "Ayana. Name means eternal blossom. She have 17 winters when they take her. Very beautiful, very brave. She fight mountain lion with stick when 12 years old save younger children." His voice roughened with pain. "Raiders come at night 3 summers past. We fight kill some, but they take 4 women, 6 children. We follow, but they have horses know desert tricks. Trail go cold near Big River. You never found any trace? Nothing. Like desert swallow her whole." He stared into distance, seeing memories instead of rocks and sky. "But I never stopped looking. Never stop hoping she still breathed somewhere." The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered desert silence before Eliza could respond. The bullet struck adobe wall inches from her head, sending dried mud chips flying like shrapnel. More shots followed immediately from multiple directions as McKee's men surrounded the station with military precision. "Found you at last," a voice shouted, not McKee himself, but one of his lieutenants. "Apache lover and runaway bride, last chance to surrender peacefully." Taza was already moving, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward stable ruins. More bullets whined overhead as they dove behind an overturned wagon, ancient wood, offering scant protection against modern firearms. 6 men. Taza said, his English becoming precise under pressure as battle-honed instincts activated. "Maybe 7. Circle like wolves." He had his rifle now, a Winchester repeater that looked well-maintained despite obvious age. Eliza watched fascinated as he sighted carefully through a gap in wagon boards and fired the report echoing across Wasteland. One attacker cried out and tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Remaining men took cover behind rocks and began systematic assault bullets, chewing steadily through the wagon's weathered sides. Splinters flew like angry wasps, while Eliza pressed flat against hard-packed earth-tasting dust and terror. Taza fired again, then again, his shots precise and economical. But they were badly outnumbered, and ammunition wouldn't last forever. Worse, she could see more riders approaching from the east. McKee himself, leading a second group with grim determination written across his face. "We can't stay here," she said, surprised by her voice's steadiness despite surrounding chaos. Taza nodded grimly, pointing toward a narrow gap in rocks behind the station, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Run when I say. Don't stop, don't look back." He waited for a brief lull in shooting, and then rose and fired rapidly, emptying his rifle in thunderous barrage that sent attackers diving for cover. Now, they ran Eliza's legs, pumping desperately, as bullets kicked dust around their fleeing feet. Behind them, angry shouts and hoofbeats indicated their escape had been spotted immediately. But Taza knew the desert in ways McKee's men couldn't hope to match, and within minutes they had vanished into canyons and ravines, requiring hours to search properly. As they paused to catch breath in an overhanging rock's shade, both gasping from exertion and fear, Eliza realized something fundamental had changed during the firefight. This was no longer simply about escaping an unwanted marriage. McKee's men had shot with clear killing intent, abandoning any pretense of bringing her back alive. Blood from a graze on her arm, she hadn't even felt the bullet's passage, dripped steadily onto sand at her feet, each crimson drop reminding her how close death had come. Looking at Taza, she saw a matching wound on his shoulder, where a bullet had torn through his shirt. They were both hurt, both hunted, both far from any help. But somehow, in that moment of shared danger, Eliza felt stronger than she had since arriving in Arizona. She was no longer a victim awaiting rescue or a prize to be claimed. She was a survivor, and she would fight for her freedom with every breath in her body. The wounded man they left at the way station, McKee's trusted foreman, Dutch Van Horn, died during the night from his injuries, but not before Taza had thoroughly searched his belongings. What they discovered in the leather saddlebag would transform their desperate flight into something far more significant and terrible. The dead man wasn't just another hired gun. He was McKee's most trusted lieutenant keeper of the ranch's darkest secrets, and he carried a leather-bound ledger that made Eliza's blood turn to ice as she read its contents by carefully concealed firelight. The entries weren't about cattle sales or ranch operations. They were shipping manifests for human cargo. Margaret Sullivan, Baltimore, arrived June 15th, shipped July 2nd, Hermosillo, 800 ore. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Anna Kowalski, Chicago, arrived July 20th, damaged goods, reduced to $400, Guaymas. Page after page contained similar entries, each representing a woman who had answered McKee's advertisements, each reduced to livestock in his meticulous records. Destinations were all south of the border mining camps and haciendas, where desperate men paid premium prices for women who would never escape, and whose disappearances would never be properly investigated. Sweet, merciful God. Eliza breathed, sinking to her knees as her situation's full horror became crystal clear. He's not just a cruel husband forcing marriage. He's selling women into slavery. Her hands shook, turning more pages, finding names and details painting systematic horror. Some entries included notes about the women's fates: died in transport, suicide before delivery, escaped, recovered, reduced price due to scarring. But it was Taza who made the connection, transforming horror into burning personal vendetta. Among loose papers in the saddlebag was an older manifest, edges yellowed with age, dated 3 years earlier. The handwriting differed, more formal, but the business was unmistakably the same. And burned into the leather cover itself was a distinctive brand mark, a serpent coiled around a crude cross. Taza went completely still, seeing it, his face becoming stone carved from the desert itself. He traced the brand with one finger, and when he looked up at Eliza, she saw something in his dark eyes that made her step back instinctively. "This mark," he said in English, made harsh by overwhelming emotion. "I know this mark." He began speaking Apache words, flowing fast and angry. Even without understanding the language, she could hear agony and rage driving his voice. When he switched back to English, words came slowly, as if each one cost something precious from his soul. 3 summers passed. Raiders come to our camp in dark time before dawn. Not soldiers, not Apache enemies. White men with covered faces moving like ghosts. They take women, take children. Young ones, pretty ones. His fist clenched around the paper until knuckles went white. Take my sister. Understanding hit Eliza like a physical blow. Ayana. These men, McKee's people, they took her. We follow raiders 7 days. Taza continued, his voice growing stronger as words poured out. Fight them twice, kill some, but they have fast horses and no desert ways. Women and children already gone when we catch them. Sold. He held up the manifest with shaking hands, tears tracking down his painted cheeks. This paper, this mark, same men who take my sister. Same evil that steal her life. The ledger told a story of systematic kidnapping and human trafficking stretching back at least 5 years. McKee wasn't operating alone. He had connections throughout the Southwest and deep into Mexico, a network of buyers and sellers trading in human misery with business-like efficiency. And somewhere in that network, if she still lived, was Taza's sister. Eliza felt the world shift as she understood what this meant. She wasn't just running from forced marriage anymore. She was key witness to a criminal operation that had destroyed dozens of lives across hundreds of miles. McKee couldn't simply let her go. She knew too much, had seen too much, represented too great a threat to his profitable enterprise. He would never stop hunting her. Never. But more than that, she realized she didn't want to simply escape anymore. Names in that ledger weren't just entries. They were women like her who had trusted the wrong man and paid the ultimate price. How many were still alive somewhere in the desert, still suffering, still hoping for rescue that would never come? "We have to stop him," she said, words coming out stronger than she felt. Not just run and hide, stop him completely. Taza met her eyes, and in that moment, they understood each other perfectly, despite barriers of language and culture. This was no longer about survival or escape. It was about justice for the dead and hope for those who might still be saved. The ledger went into Eliza's torn dress, pressed against her heart like a sacred relic. Evidence. Proof. The weapon they would use to destroy Jared McKee and his entire operation, if they lived long enough to use it. The sun, at merciless midday, felt like a living entity pressing down with malevolent intent as they struggled across terrain designed to punish human ambition. Eliza's arm, wound from the previous day's gunfight, had worsened overnight edges, angry red and swollen with infection, sending tendrils of fire through her body with each labored step. They had been walking since before dawn, trying to put distance between themselves and the way station where Dutch Van Horn's body would soon draw unwanted attention. The landscape here was particularly brutal, sharp volcanic rocks slicing through boot remnants and loose scree turning every footstep into potential disaster. Eliza's fever made her clumsy vision blurring at edges as dehydration and infection took their toll. When she stumbled on loose stone, sending her sprawling against a boulder, the precious water gourd, their last life source in merciless wilderness, flew from her weak grip and struck a jagged rock edge with a sound like breaking bones. The sight of their water gurgling into thirsty sand was the most devastating thing she had ever witnessed. They both stared at the dark stain spreading through dust, watching survival chances drain away. With each passing second, the gourd was cracked beyond repair, and sand drank their precious water greedily, leaving only damp earth as evidence of catastrophic loss. "I'm sorry," Eliza whispered, despair tears mixing with sweat on fevered cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I've killed us both." Taza knelt beside the ruined gourd, running damp sand through his fingers like a man counting disaster's cost. When he looked up, his expression was grim, but not defeated, the face of someone who had survived too much to surrender to despair. He pointed toward distant mountains where massive thunderheads built on the horizon like dark towers reaching toward heaven. "Rain comes to high places," he said, "but also brings flash flood. Very dangerous for people caught in low ground." Eliza followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The clouds were enormous, towering thunderheads, promising violent storms in high country. Rain falling miles upstream would funnel through countless arroyos and canyons, turning dry creek beds into raging torrents within minutes. "How far to next water?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Taza studied landscape with practiced eyes, calculating distances and obstacles with precision of someone whose life depended on such estimates. 1 day walking for strong person. Maybe 2 days for. He gestured at her obvious weakness, fevered state, infected wound, sapping her strength. The unspoken question hung between them. Should he leave her behind and save himself? It would be the practical choice, cold logic of desert survival. She was slowing him down, consuming resources he could ill afford to share. She could see internal struggle playing across his weathered features. Memory of his sister debt he felt to women who had suffered under McKee's system warred with harsh mathematics of survival in unforgiving land. "You should go," she said, finally making the choice before he had to. "Take the ledger. Find someone in authority who can use it to stop McKee and save those women. Don't let them die for nothing." For a moment, she thought he would agree. His hand moved toward papers tucked in her dress, eyes looking toward mountains where safety might wait for a man traveling alone. Then he shook his head, decision made with finality of a man who had weighed honor against survival and chosen honor. We go together, he said simply. Live together or die together. This is Apache way. Before she could protest, he knelt with his back toward her. Ride, he said. Save strength for what comes. Eliza hesitated, aware of her weight and his existing injuries. She was not small, and Taza was already weakened by his shoulder wound and constant flight stress. Carrying her would tax his strength terribly in this heat. But she could see this wasn't a request. It was his solution to their shared problem, his way of honoring both survival and loyalty. With careful movements, she climbed onto his back, wrapping arms around his neck and trying to distribute her weight evenly. Taza stood smoothly, adjusted his grip on her legs, and began walking toward mountains with measured pace of a man understanding. This was now a race against time and human endurance limits. Above them, storm clouds continued building, promising either salvation or destruction in equal measure. Vultures circled lazily in thermal updrafts, patient predators waiting to see which force would prove stronger: human will to survive, or the desert's implacable hunger. With each step, Eliza felt Taza's strength slowly ebbing, his breathing becoming labored despite attempts to hide growing exhaustion. She pressed her face against his shoulder and whispered prayers to any listening god, asking not for miraculous rescue, but simply for the chance to see justice done before the desert claimed them both. Behind them, dust clouds on the horizon suggested their pursuers had discovered Dutch Van Horn's body and were closing in with renewed determination. The final race had begun. The storm that had been building struck with concentrated fury, transforming the peaceful desert into a maelstrom of wind, sand, and torrential rain, seeming to come from every direction. What had begun as distant thunder became continuous roar that seemed to shake Earth's foundations, while lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, burning afterimages into retinas. Taza and Eliza had taken shelter in what appeared to be a dry creek bed, pressed against a sandstone bank's overhang as the storm raged overhead with increasing violence. The fever from her infected wound made Eliza delirious, and she drifted in and out of consciousness as Taza tried keeping them both alive through nature's assault. It was during one of these fevered episodes that a familiar voice cut through the wind. Well, well, the runaway bride and her savage protector. Through the rain curtain, a figure approached, not McKee or his men, but Thomas Brennan, the surveyor from her stagecoach journey. But now he carried a rifle with practiced ease, and his earlier gentle manner had vanished completely. Mr. Brennan. Eliza gasped, confusion mixing with fear. What are you doing here? Brennan's laugh was cold as winter wind. Doing my job, Miss Markham. Though I must say you've provided considerably more entertainment than most assignments. Taza was instantly alert, his hand moving to his knife. But Brennan had the advantage of position and superior firepower. You see, Brennan continued, seemingly oblivious to the storm raging around them. Mr. McKee is a careful man. He likes to know exactly what he's purchasing before committing to significant investments. That's where I come in. I evaluate the merchandise during transport, ensure there are no unpleasant surprises upon delivery. Understanding crashed over Eliza like the storm itself. You're one of his men. You've been watching me since Baltimore. Watching, evaluating, reporting. Your background check was most thorough, I assure you. Baltimore society belle, fallen on hard times, parents recently deceased, no family connections to cause complications if you were to disappear. You were perfect for McKee's purposes. The silver pocket watch with its serpent design, she should have recognized the connection to the brand in McKee's ledger. Brennan had been displaying his allegiance, openly confident in his deception. How did you find us? Taza demanded in English, clearer than any he had used before. I've been tracking you since the way station. McKee's men are good, but they're not subtle. I prefer to work alone. Brennan's eyes glittered with predatory satisfaction. You killed Dutch Van Horn, and that was unfortunate. He was useful. but you've saved me considerable effort by eliminating so many of the others." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Brennan hadn't been helping McKee hunt her. He had been waiting for the opportunity to eliminate both her and McKee's remaining men, leaving himself as the sole survivor who could claim credit for recovering the stolen property and the incriminating ledger. "McKee doesn't know you're here," Eliza realized. "McKee will be dead within the hour along with his remaining men. A tragic victim of this terrible storm, I'm afraid. Flash floods are so unpredictable in this country." Brennan raised his rifle. "As will you and your Apache friend once I've retrieved the ledger you so carelessly stole." But Taza had been listening not just to Brennan's words, but to the storm itself. His desert-trained ears had detected something Brennan's urban sensibilities missed in the deep, rumbling roar that preceded flash floods. "Eliza," he said quietly, "when I move, climb high, very high, fast as you can." How touching. Last words between lovers. Brennan sneered, taking aim. That's when the wall of water exploded around the canyon bend. The flash flood struck with devastating force. But this time, it wasn't salvation. By chance, it was the culmination of everything Taza had been observing about the storm patterns, wind direction, and water flow indicators that white men couldn't read. He had deliberately led them to this position knowing the storm would create exactly this scenario. Brennan, caught completely off guard by the torrent's sudden appearance, was swept away instantly, his rifle disappearing into the churning brown water as he fought desperately to keep his head above the surface. Taza grabbed Eliza and thrust her toward a narrow ledge 15 feet up the canyon wall. "Climb now." Her hands, strengthened by weeks of desert survival, found purchase on the rough stone. The infection-weakened muscles in her arms screamed with effort, but she pulled herself up inch by agonizing inch as the flood raged below. Taza followed, but as he reached for the ledge, Brennan's hand shot out of the water and grasped his ankle with drowning man's desperation. "If I die, you die with me." Brennan screamed over the flood's roar. The current was pulling both men downstream away from the safety of the ledge. Eliza watched in horror as Taza struggled against both the flood and Brennan's death, grip his strength ebbing as the cold water sapped his remaining energy. That's when she remembered the metal hairpin still tucked in her dress, the same tool she had used to escape McKee's ranch, sharpened to a needlepoint by her desperate work on the window bars. Without hesitation, she slid back down into the torrent, fighting the current that threatened to sweep her away. The water was powerful enough to drown a horse filled with debris that battered her body, but she forced herself toward the struggling men. Brennan saw her coming and released Taza to grab for her instead, recognizing her as the more valuable prize. "The ledger, girl." "Where is the ledger?" As his hands closed around her throat, Eliza drove the sharpened hairpin deep into the major artery in his neck, using anatomical knowledge gleaned from helping her father treat customers' injuries in his watch repair shop. Blood spurted into the muddy water as Brennan's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. "In hell with McKee." She gasped, twisting the improvised weapon deeper. Brennan's grip loosened as his life poured out into the flood. The current caught his dying body and swept it away around the next bend, leaving Taza and Eliza alone in the gradually receding torrent. As they clung to each other in the aftermath, both wounded and exhausted, but miraculously alive, Eliza realized that something fundamental had changed within her. The terrified woman who had fled Baltimore no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had faced the worst humanity could offer and survived through intelligence, courage, and the willingness to do whatever necessary to protect the innocent. The storm was passing, and with it, the immediate danger. But they both understood that their real work was just beginning. Somewhere ahead lay McKee and his remaining men, and beyond that, the possibility of justice for all the women whose names filled that precious ledger. They had survived the desert's trial by water and blood. Now it was time to finish what they had started. 3 days after the flood had claimed Thomas Brennan and scattered McKee's surviving men, a column of smoke rose from a distant mesa 3 distinct plumes spelling "help needed" in the ancient visual language of the Apache people. Taza had managed to build the signal fire despite his injuries using techniques passed down through generations, who had learned to communicate across vast distances using nothing but flame and timing. Eliza lay in the precious shade of a boulder, and the ledger still pressed against her chest, watching the smoke dissipate into crystal-clear desert air. Her fever had finally broken completely, but she remained weak from infection and accumulated exhaustion. Every breath required conscious effort. Every movement reminded her how close they had both come to joining their enemies in death. "Will they come?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Taza nodded with quiet confidence, though strain showed in his face as he struggled to remain upright. "My people watch high places always. They will come." By evening, rhythmic hoofbeats announced the arrival of 6 Apache riders, led by an older man whose weathered face bore scars of countless battles and wisdom from surviving them all. This was Naiche Taza's uncle and one of the war chiefs of their band. The conversation that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, but Eliza could follow its emotional flow by watching faces and gestures. Naiche was clearly displeased at Taza for involving himself with a white woman at the situation, bringing soldiers and bounty hunters into their territory, and at complications this would create for their already struggling people. But as Taza explained what had happened, showing the ledger and speaking his sister's name with unmistakable pain, then the older man's expression gradually shifted from anger to something approaching understanding. When Taza finished his account, Naiche studied Eliza with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to measure not just her physical condition, but her character and worthiness. Finally, he spoke in carefully chosen English. "You have brought much trouble to our people, white woman. But my nephew tells me you fought for justice, not just for your own skin. This is the only reason you still draw breath." The journey back to the Apache stronghold took 3 full days with Eliza, riding double behind one of the younger warriors, while Taza was supported by another, whose steady hands kept him from falling when weakness overcame him. She was surprised by their gentleness. These men, feared throughout the territory, treated her wounds with the same careful attention they gave their own. The hidden camp was located in a canyon so remote that no white man had ever discovered it. Perhaps 50 people lived there in carefully constructed shelters, men, women, and children who had chosen to continue traditional ways despite increasing American encroachment. They accepted Eliza's presence with quiet dignity, providing clean clothes to replace her ruined dress and a comfortable place to rest while her body slowly recovered. It was during her second week in the camp that the Mexican trader arrived with news that would change everything. Vasquez was a small, nervous man who dealt in supplies and information, walking the dangerous line between Apache bands and American settlements. When he saw Eliza sitting by one of the cooking fires, his eyes widened with recognition. "Señora," he said in broken English, "I know your face from posters. But strange thing, the men searching for you are not bounty hunters. They wear badges of federal marshals. They say you have important information about women who have disappeared." Hope flared in Eliza's chest. "Federal marshals, are you certain?" "Very certain, Señora. They have come to Red Mesa asking many questions about Señor McKee and his business. The people there are very frightened and many lies are being told. But these marshals are not stupid men." Naiche, listening to this conversation with growing interest, asked several sharp questions in Spanish. Vasquez's answers seemed to satisfy him, and the war chief nodded thoughtfully. "It appears," he said to Eliza, "that your enemy's death has created what you white people call a power vacuum. His remaining men fight among themselves, and some have begun to speak freely in hopes of saving their own necks. The justice you seek may finally be riding toward Red Mesa." That evening, as Eliza sat by the central fire, studying the ledger's entries by flickering light, Taza approached and settled beside her. His shoulder was healing well under the medicine woman's care, and the terrible tension that had driven him during their desperate flight was finally beginning to ease. "What will you do when the marshals come?" he asked quietly. It was a question she had been pondering for days. The safe choice would be to remain here among the Apache, to disappear into their world, and never face civilization's complications again. Here she was protected and valued for who she had proven herself to be. But the ledger represented something larger than her own security. Each name written in McKee's script represented a woman who deserved justice, a family who deserved answers. She couldn't hide while their stories remained untold. "I have to go back," she said finally. "Not to Red Mesa, but to the territorial authorities. These women need someone to speak for them who was there, who saw the evidence firsthand." Taza nodded as if he had expected this answer. "And after the trials are finished, when justice has been served?" Eliza looked around the camp at people who had accepted her despite every reason to distrust outsiders, and felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death, genuine belonging. "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "For the first time in my adult life, I have real choices to make. It's both terrifying and wonderful." "Vasquez says the federal marshals will be in Tucson next week," Taza said. "It is a long ride, but safer than attempting to return to Red Mesa. Will you take me there?" "Of course. We began this journey together, and we will finish it together." The federal courthouse in Tucson was an imposing adobe structure that seemed to absorb desert heat and radiate authority. Eliza stood on its broad steps, wearing a simple but respectable dark blue dress the Apache women had sewn for her, the precious ledger secured in a leather document case Vasquez had procured. Beside her, Taza waited with characteristic stillness, his traditional clothing drawing curious but respectful stares from the mixed crowd conducting business in this crossroads city. The meeting with U.S. Marshal William Harrison had been carefully arranged through intermediaries. Harrison proved exactly what Eliza had hoped: a career law enforcement officer in his 50s, with intelligent gray eyes and quiet, unshakable competence that inspired immediate confidence. He listened to her complete story without interruption, occasionally making brief notes, his expression growing progressively more grim as McKee's criminal enterprise's full scope became clear. "Ma'am," he said when she finished, "what you're describing represents one of the largest human trafficking operations we've encountered in the territories. If this ledger proves authentic, and I have no reason to doubt your testimony, then we're looking at federal crimes stretching across state boundaries and international borders." He opened the document case with reverent care and studied the pages with a trained eye. After several minutes, occasionally referring to a separate file, he looked up with professional satisfaction. 7 names in this ledger match missing person reports filed with various law enforcement agencies across 3 states, he said. 3 more correspond to descriptions provided by families searching desperately for their daughters. This documentation is exactly the evidence we needed to build a comprehensive federal case. The legal proceedings that followed stretched across several intensive weeks, with Eliza testifying before a territorial grand jury, and later appearing as key witness in multiple trials. The story that emerged painted a horrifying picture of systematic brutality that shocked even veteran frontier lawmen. McKee's operation had been directly responsible for the disappearance and enslavement of at least 26 women over 6 years, with documented connections to similar criminal enterprises throughout the Southwest and deep into Mexico. Most importantly for Taza, the investigation led to crucial information about the raiders who had taken his sister. The distinctive brand mark in McKee's ledger connected directly to a larger trafficking network based in Sonora, Mexico, and federal authorities were coordinating with Mexican officials to locate and shut down the remote camps where kidnapped women were held. "We can't make promises about what we'll find," Marshal Harrison told Taza during one of their private meetings. "The trail is 3 years old, and conditions in those camps are—" He left the sentence diplomatically unfinished. "I understand." Taza replied with quiet dignity. But knowing the truth is infinitely better than living with uncertainty. And if Ayanna still draws breath somewhere, she will know someone cared enough to search. The final surprise came on the last day of trials as Eliza prepared to leave Tucson and begin building whatever new life awaited her. She had been offered a position with a charitable organization dedicated to helping trafficking victims meaningful work that would allow her to continue fighting for justice while establishing herself in respectable society. She was saying farewell to Taza in the courthouse garden when Marshal Harrison approached with a telegram clutched in his hand and barely contained excitement illuminating his weathered features. "Miss Markham, Mr. Taza," he said, slightly breathless from hurrying. "I have extraordinary news. Mexican authorities conducted a successful raid on a mining camp in Sonora yesterday, acting directly on information from our investigation." He handed the telegram to Taza, who read it slowly, his face betraying no emotion, despite the magnitude of what the words contained. But Eliza could see his hands trembling slightly as he held the precious paper. "Ayanna?" she asked softly. Taza nodded momentarily, unable to speak, as 3 years of pain and uncertainty finally resolved into overwhelming relief. When he found his voice, words came out thick with long-suppressed emotion. "Alive," he managed. "Injured and weakened, but alive. She is being transported to the mission hospital in Magdalena for medical care." Eliza felt tears streaming down her face as she watched years of anguish transform into hope. The sister who had motivated Taza to risk everything for a complete stranger was finally coming home. But Marshal Harrison wasn't finished. "The camp they raided," he continued, satisfaction heavy in his voice, "held 17 women and young girls, all kidnapped from various locations. Thanks to your ledger and testimony, we were able to identify most of them and notify their families. You've helped save more lives than you'll ever fully comprehend, Miss Markham." As they stood together in the garden with desert sun warming their faces and normal life continuing around them, Eliza felt profound completion wash over her. The terrified woman who had fled into the wasteland was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of facing whatever challenges the future might hold. "What will you do now?" she asked Taza. "Go to my sister first," he said without hesitation. "Help her heal from whatever she has endured. Then perhaps continue this work. There are still other women missing other families who deserve answers." Eliza nodded, understanding completely. The fight against injustice was never truly finished. It simply moved from one battleground to another. "If you ever need assistance," she said, meaning every word, "you know exactly where to find me." They said farewell, simply without dramatic declarations. They had shared something transcending ordinary friendship, a crucible experience that had forged them both into stronger, better versions of themselves, while creating an unbreakable bond of mutual respect. As Taza mounted his horse and rode south toward Mexico, and his long-lost sister Eliza watched from the courthouse steps until he disappeared into the heat shimmer, marking the horizon. Then she turned toward her own uncertain but hopeful future, carrying the unshakable knowledge that sometimes, when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, even the desert itself rises up to help them fight. The ledger that had begun as evidence of terrible crimes became the foundation for new territorial laws protecting vulnerable women. McKee's entire network was systematically dismantled within 18 months, and similar operations throughout the region found it much more difficult to operate in the changed legal landscape. And in a small mission hospital in Sonora, an Apache woman named Ayanna began the long journey back to her people, and her life carrying with her the knowledge that her brother had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, and never stopped believing that love and determination could conquer even the vast emptiness of the desert. Marshal Harrison's final words to Eliza captured the essence of what they had accomplished. "You came west seeking a husband, and found something infinitely more important. You found yourself and your purpose. The women whose names fill that ledger can finally rest in peace, knowing their suffering was not forgotten and their deaths were not meaningless. In the end, that knowledge was enough, more than enough. Looking back on this tale of Eliza Markham and Taza, we find more than just an adventure story set against the harsh beauty of the American frontier. This is a story about the transformative power of human courage when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. Eliza's journey teaches us that strength often emerges not from comfort, but from the crucible of adversity. She began as a woman constrained by society's expectations, desperate enough to travel across a continent to marry a stranger. Yet when confronted with true evil, she discovered reserves of courage, intelligence, and moral fortitude she never knew she possessed. Her transformation reminds us that we are all capable of far more than we imagine, that the person we become in our darkest hour may be the truest version of ourselves. Taza's character illuminates the universal nature of love and loss. Despite the barriers of race, culture, and language that should have separated him from Eliza, he recognized in her the same fierce spirit that lived in his beloved sister. His willingness to risk everything for a stranger teaches us that compassion transcends all boundaries when we choose to see the humanity in others rather than focus on our differences. The story also serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears a civilized mask. McKee's refined manners and educated speech concealed a monster who traded in human suffering. Thomas Brennan's gentle demeanor during the stagecoach journey hid his role as an evaluator of human merchandise. These characters warn us to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, regardless of surface appearances or social expectations. Perhaps most importantly, this tale demonstrates that justice is not something that happens to us. It is something we must actively pursue and create. Neither Eliza nor Taza waited for rescue or relied on others to solve their problems. They took responsibility for their own survival, and ultimately for the survival of others who could not speak for themselves. The desert that nearly destroyed them also forged them into something stronger. It stripped away everything, superfluous social pretenses, comfortable lies, the luxury of moral ambiguity, until only essential truth remained. In that harsh landscape, they learned that character is not what we profess to believe, but what we do when everything is at stake. Their story reminds us that real heroism is not about being fearless, but about acting despite our fears. It is about choosing to help others, even when we ourselves are vulnerable. It is about refusing to accept injustice, even when fighting it seems hopeless. In our own lives, we may never face the extreme dangers that Eliza and Taza encountered in the Arizona desert. But we all face moments when we must choose between safety and justice, between comfort and courage, between indifference and compassion. When those moments come, may we remember that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender their principles, no matter the cost. The wasteland that nearly claimed their lives ultimately became the place where they discovered their true selves. Perhaps that is the desert's greatest gift, not the harsh lessons it teaches, but the strength it reveals was within us all along.